The Hamas-Israel conflict is one of the most enduring and complex conflicts in the modern world, deeply rooted in historical, political, and religious tensions between Israelis and Palestinians. At its core, the conflict revolves around land, national identity, security, and the broader Israeli-Palestinian struggle. While the Israeli-Palestinian conflict dates back to the early 20th century, the specific conflict between Hamas and Israel has become a focal point of violence, ideology, and competing narratives, especially since Hamas took control of the Gaza Strip in 2007. The Islamic resistance movement was founded in 1987 during the First Intifada, or uprising, against Israeli occupation. Hamas emerged as an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood and positioned itself as a Palestinian resistance movement dedicated to liberating Palestine and establishing an Islamic state in all of what it considers historic Palestine, which includes present-day Israel. Unlike the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, which eventually recognized Israel and pursued a two-state solution, Hamas explicitly rejects Israel's right to exist and advocates armed resistance. Hamas's charter originally called for the destruction of Israel and promoted violent jihad as a means of achieving this goal. Though the group has moderated some of its rhetoric in recent years, particularly regarding its political approach, its refusal to recognize Israel remains a central tenet. Hamas is both a militant organization and a political entity. It gained political prominence in 2006, winning legislative elections in the Palestinian territories, defeating the Fatah party, which had been the dominant force in Palestinian politics for decades. After a violent power struggle between Hamas and Fatah, Hamas seized full control of the Gaza Strip in 2007, isolating it from the West Bank, which is governed by the Palestinian Authority under Fatah. Since then, Gaza has been under Hamas's rule, and its relations with Israel have been marked by repeated rounds of conflict, particularly due to Hamas's militant activities, including rocket attacks and incursions. The Gaza Strip is a densely populated coastal enclave of around 2 million people. After Hamas took control, Israel and Egypt imposed a blockade on Gaza, restricting the movement of goods and people in and out of the territory. The blockade was implemented with the aim of containing Hamas and preventing it from importing weapons and materials that could be used for military purposes. However, the blockade has had devastating humanitarian consequences for the population, leading to widespread poverty, unemployment, and shortages of essential goods, including medical supplies. Gaza's economy has been crippled, and living conditions have deteriorated significantly. The lack of clean water, electricity, and adequate infrastructure has created a humanitarian crisis, exacerbated by the repeated cycles of violence between Hamas and Israel. The isolation of Gaza has also deepened the divide between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, complicating efforts to present a united Palestinian front in peace negotiations. Hamas operates a well-organized and heavily armed military wing, the Izz ad-Din al-Qassam Brigades, which has conducted numerous attacks against Israel. The group's tactics include suicide bombings, cross-border raids, and rocket attacks aimed at Israeli civilian areas. Hamas's rocket arsenal has grown significantly over the years, thanks in part to smuggling networks and locally produced weapons. These rockets, while often inaccurate, have a psychological and physical impact on Israeli civilians, particularly in towns and cities near Gaza. Hamas has also built a network of underground tunnels, used for smuggling weapons and conducting attacks on Israeli soldiers. These tunnels, which Hamas has dug beneath the Gaza-Israel border, have been a major focus of Israeli military operations aimed at destroying them. The use of civilian areas as launching sites for rockets and as cover for military activities has drawn widespread condemnation, as it puts Gaza's civilian population in harm's way. For Israel, the conflict with Hamas is framed primarily as a matter of national security and survival. Since its establishment in 1948, Israel has faced hostility from its neighbors, and the constant threat of attacks from Hamas and other militant groups in Gaza has reinforced a defensive posture. Israel views Hamas's refusal to recognize its right to exist, coupled with its ongoing attacks, as an existential threat that must be met with military force. Israel has launched multiple large-scale military operations against Hamas, most notably in 2008 to 2009, 2012, 2014, and 2021. These operations, often referred to as wars or conflicts, typically begin in response to rocket fire from Gaza and aim to weaken Hamas's military infrastructure, including its rocket launching capabilities and tunnel networks. Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system, which intercepts many of the rockets fired from Gaza, has been crucial in preventing larger-scale civilian casualties. But the psychological toll on Israelis, especially those living near Gaza, remains significant. The Gaza-Israel conflicts have been marked by high civilian casualties, particularly on the Palestinian side. Gaza's dense population and Hamas's tactic of operating in civilian areas make it difficult for Israel to conduct precise military operations without causing civilian harm. Israeli airstrikes, artillery fire, and ground incursions have led to the destruction of homes, schools, hospitals, and critical infrastructure in Gaza. While Israel maintains that it takes significant measures to minimize civilian casualties, including issuing warnings before airstrikes, the scale of the destruction has drawn sharp criticism from the international community. Many human rights organizations accuse Israel of using disproportionate force, while others criticize Hamas for using civilians as human shields and firing rockets indiscriminately at Israeli cities. The United Nations and various governments around the world have repeatedly called for ceasefires during flare-ups, but these have been temporary at best. The cyclical nature of the violence means that once one round of fighting ends, tensions simmer until they boil over again. The lack of a long-term political solution ensures that the violence remains ongoing. The Hamas-Israel conflict cannot be fully understood in isolation from the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which has its roots in competing nationalist movements. The question of statehood, territorial boundaries, and the status of Jerusalem remains unresolved. The Israeli occupation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, the building of Israeli settlements in these areas, and the status of millions of Palestinian refugees are all key issues fueling the conflict. Hamas's rise to power has complicated these dynamics, as it has remained outside the framework of peace negotiations that have been attempted in the past. Efforts to resolve the broader conflict, such as the Oslo Accords in the 1990s, which aimed to create a two-state solution, have repeatedly failed. The division between Hamas, which controls Gaza, and the Palestinian Authority, which governs parts of the West Bank, has further stalled any potential peace agreement. The political division between the Palestinian factions weakens the Palestinians' negotiating position, making it more difficult to present a unified demand for statehood. The Hamas-Israel conflict has regional and global ramifications. Iran, a major backer of Hamas, provides funding, weapons, and training to the group as part of its broader regional strategy to challenge Israel. The conflict also impacts Israel's relationships with its Arab neighbors. While Israel has normalized relations with several Arab states through the Abraham Accords, including the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, the ongoing violence in Gaza remains a point of tension. Internationally, the conflict draws sharp divides. Western nations, particularly the United States, have traditionally supported Israel's right to defend itself, although there is growing criticism of Israeli military tactics, particularly in progressive political circles. On the other hand, many nations and activist groups around the world support the Palestinian cause, viewing the blockade of Gaza and Israeli military actions as oppressive. The situation in Gaza, where over 2 million people live under blockade, has been described as a humanitarian disaster. 80% of the population relies on international aid, unemployment rates are extremely high, and access to basic services like healthcare, clean water, and electricity is severely limited. Israel controls most of the borders, sea access, and airspace around Gaza, further isolating the territory. The economic blockade, combined with the damage from repeated conflicts, has left much of Gaza in ruins. Efforts to rebuild are slow, and with each new conflict, infrastructure is destroyed once again. The conflict between Hamas and Israel is not just about immediate military actions, it's about deep-rooted issues that have festered for decades. Without addressing the core issues of Palestinian statehood, Israeli security, and mutual recognition, any ceasefires or truces are likely to be temporary. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza, the fear and trauma experienced by civilians on both sides, and the political impasse all make a lasting peace seem distant. The road to peace would likely require difficult concessions from both sides, including Hamas recognizing Israel's right to exist and Israel addressing Palestinian demands for sovereignty and an end to the occupation. Until then, the Hamas-Israel conflict remains a flashpoint in the broader Israeli-Palestinian struggle, with periodic violence, heavy civilian casualties, and deepening distrust on both sides.